Have you ever really stopped to think about words like culture or soft power? We use them all the time, especially when we talk about international relations, but do we always grasp just how layered they are? Turns out there's a whole lot going on beneath the surface. Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're unpacking a fascinating stack of sources on culture, power, and global understanding. Our mission to cut through some of the noise, maybe reveal a few surprises, and hopefully give you a more nuanced take on these really foundational concepts, especially useful if you're into international relations and politics. Oh, and before we dive in, just a quick note. You're listening to a special segment from Diplomacy and International Relations by Bastian Friedborg. If you like what you hear today, you can actually subscribe to the full podcast. It's on Spotify. It costs a small monthly fee, and that support genuinely helps keep the show going. Plus, you get access to extra episodes. Just check out the link in the description. Okay, so let's start with culture. We use that word constantly. It seems pretty straightforward, right? But our sources immediately start questioning that. Why is it so, well, slippery, even for academics?
It's fascinating, honestly, because the very act of talking about different cultures, defining them, can sort of accidentally reinforce separations. It can even imply a kind of hierarchy. One source highlights that historically there have been literally hundreds of definitions. Think about that. Kroeber and Klakon found over 160 way back in 1952.
Wow, 160.
Yeah. And even by the 90s, there still wasn't really a solid consensus in academia about what culture truly is. It's just elusive.
So it's not just a neutral label then. It's like when we say, France has a culture or Japan has a culture, we often picture this neat, contained, timeless thing.
Exactly. And one source points out that anthropology itself, the discipline studying culture, might have sometimes helped build and maintain these quite rigid ideas. A bit like how the concept of race was used historically to fix differences between people.
That's a heavy comparison.
It is. But the point is about how these concepts can freeze difference. Even if we now understand differences as multiple and not necessarily hierarchical, the idea of distinct cultures can still kind of trap them, denying them history or change. Think Orientalism, that whole way the West constructed a simplified, often distorted view of the East, mapping everything onto fixed categories.
Right, freezing them in time almost.
Precisely. Which leads to a really interesting question. What if we try to actively write against culture?
How would you even do that?
Well, anthropologist Leila Abulukhud suggests something called ethnographies of the particular. So instead of making these sweeping statements about entire groups,
You focus small.
exactly, you focus on specific individuals, their lives, their relationships. The idea is to use these stories, she calls it tactical humanism, to reveal the power dynamics underneath and sort of dismantle those rigid cultural boxes. It's a way to get past assumptions of everyone in a group being the same.
That idea of freezing differences is powerful. So if our definitions are shaped like this, what does it mean for how we understand ourselves and others?
Well, it suggests our sense of self isn't just natural, it's constructed. And often building that self involves defining it against an other.
Which can be inherently problematic.
It can carry a kind of violence, yeah.
Yeah.
By downplaying or ignoring internal differences or differences within the other. The sources mention feminists and halfies. People with mixed cultural backgrounds from migration or maybe international education. Their very experiences kind of challenge these neat self-author divides in anthropology. They highlight the power involved in drawing those lines. And if we zoom out and connect this to international relations, well, suddenly it makes sense why traditional theories like realism or liberalism kind of sidelined culture for so long.
Right, they were focused elsewhere.
Completely. They looked at the hard stuff, military might, state security, economic interests. Culture just didn't seem like a primary driver in that view.
It is surprising, though, looking back, that they'd ignore it so much. Why the big comeback now? You mentioned constructivism, the English school, critical theory. What are those mainstream theories missing?
They were missing the social fabric, really. The shared ideas, the norms, the identities that actually shape how states act. This comeback acknowledges that culture is, well, crucial if you want to understand why political events happen, beyond just the dollars and cents or the military balance.
So even anarchy isn't just anarchy.
Exactly. Even the concept of international anarchy, the lack of a world government, can have its own political culture. Realism, for example, with its constant focus on conflict and self-interest, arguably fosters a culture of distrust between states.
Whereas liberalism.
Liberalism's emphasis on cooperation on international institutions potentially builds a different kind of culture, maybe one closer to an international community. It's all about the underlying normative environment, the shared beliefs about what's acceptable or expected behavior.
And it goes deeper than just state interactions, right? You mentioned critical theory.
Yes. Critical theory digs into something really subtle but powerful. It argues that modern capitalism doesn't just rely on economics to keep going. It uses culture,
How so?
often by creating what they call false needs, think consumerism, that distract us from deeper inequalities or social problems. Critical theory is very focused on ethics, on what should be. It aims to reduce global inequality, respect diversity, and foster dialogue, aiming for what Gramsci called a mutual culture.
This links nicely to identity politics, doesn't it? It's not just one side of the spectrum.
Not at all. One of our sources discusses Nils Holtug's work, making the point that identity politics isn't exclusively left-wing or postmodern. It exists on the right too, and it can be compatible with liberal ideas.
But it's a double-edged sword.
Definitely. It can be a tool to expand opportunities for marginalized groups, which is positive, but it can also potentially fragment society if it becomes too divisive. And this feeds directly into constructivism, the idea that a state's identity, its beliefs about itself and others, is fundamentally shaped by culture. And that identity, in turn, dictates its interests and its foreign policy. Ignoring that, constructivists say, means you're missing a huge piece of the puzzle.
Okay, let's switch gears slightly. Let's talk soft power. Joseph Nye's term, it's been everywhere in IR for decades now. It sounds so appealing, right? Influence through attraction, not force, almost.
Yeah, it does sound nice, yeah. Nye introduced it back in 1990 in Bound to Lead. His core idea was that a state could make its power seem legitimate, attractive, so others want to follow its lead because they admire its culture, its values, its policies.
And the context was key then.
Absolutely. He was arguing against the idea that America was declining after the Cold War ended. He suggested the U.S. could stay on top not just through military might, but by shaping international norms through this soft power.
But, as our sources show, it's not that simple. Even Nye himself saw its limits. You mentioned Turkey.
Right. In 2015, Nye noted that Turkey's soft power seemed to be declining, and he linked it directly to domestic issues. Less soft power, less democracy, as he put it, after some significant internal political changes there.
So it's not static, it's tied to what's actually happening inside the country.
Exactly. And that's kind of where the criticism comes in. The concept became so popular, such a buzzword, that some argue it lost its analytical edge.
How so?
Well, critics say it can become a bit of a rhetorical tool, maybe prone to creating stereotypes. Countries might focus on promoting, say, Japanese manga, or Indian Bollywood, or China's Confucius Institutes.
Thinking that translates directly into political clout.
Right. But does it?
Yeah.
That source calls it analytical blurring. It kind of obscures the real, often harder power dynamics at play.
It does make you wonder, okay, Turkish soap operas are huge in the Middle East. Does that cultural capital actually convert into political capital?
Well, one study looked at exactly that. Turkish soap exports to the Middle East, and found basically no systematic link between how popular the shows were and whether people supported Turkey's foreign policy.
So wearing jeans doesn't mean you automatically love U.S. foreign policy.
Pretty much. It highlights a crucial point about reception. Audiences aren't just empty vessels soaking up messages. They interpret, they decode, they sometimes even twist messages to fit their own views or agendas. They have their own arts of doing, as one theorist put it.
Can you give an example of that?
Sure. The Gulen Movement's schools in Africa. They were intended partly as a Turkish soft power initiative. But sometimes the students' own goals or agendas clashed with what Turkey intended. In some cases, it actually led to feelings of rejection, not attraction.
Wow, so it can backfire.
It absolutely can. It just shows the complexity, the unpredictable interplay between state intentions, private actors like schools or media companies, and crucially, how domestic politics affects a country's image and influence abroad.
Okay, so soft power is complicated, maybe even a bit messy, but let's flip to a possibly more optimistic angle. Our sources also talk about straightforward cultural exchange, the actual interchange of ideas, beliefs, traditions.
Yes, and this deep dive points to some really practical frameworks for making that work effectively. Things like intercultural communication competence, ICC, and cultural intelligence, or CQ.
Okay, break those down a bit. ICC and CQ.
So ICC is largely about adapting how you communicate, understanding different styles, and building empathy across cultures. CQ, cultural intelligence, is more about being effective in diverse cultural settings. It involves things like metacognition.
Thinking about your thinking.
Yeah, basically being aware of your own cultural assumptions. Plus, having the right knowledge, the motivation to engage, and adapting your behavior appropriately. These are really vital skills in our globalized world. They lead to better relationships, less misunderstanding.
And we see this happening on the ground, right? Like that group in Canada.
Exactly, the Saskatoon Niger Delta Forum. About 300 members, mostly Nigerian migrants. Their whole motto is bridging cultures, nurturing diversity. And at a place like Canada, with such high immigration leading the G7 in population growth in 2022, because of it, this kind of thing is incredibly relevant.
What do they actually do?
Well, they organized this retreat, Stepping Out, specifically to help members integrate into Canadian society while also keeping their own cultural traditions alive. They share traditional food, plantain pepper soup, a goosey soup. They showcase unique dress styles. It's a great example of a diaspora community enriching their new home while staying connected to their roots.
It really underlines those core benefits, doesn't it? Fostering understanding, respect, maybe even promoting stability in the long run.
Absolutely. And stimulating economic growth through things like tourism and trade, preserving heritage. The list goes on.
But it's not all smooth sailing, presumably.
No, definitely not. The sources are clear on the challenges too. Language barriers are obvious. Then there's culture shock, potential ethical dilemmas, dealing with stereotypes, even accidental cultural appropriation.
So it requires effort, real, respectful effort.
Exactly. Genuine exchange has to be reciprocal and respectful. You have to acknowledge that communication is harder when norms and expectations differ so much. Which brings us to maybe the trickiest arena, multilateral diplomacy. How does all this cultural diversity play out when the stakes are really high?
And the sources suggest it has a huge impact, right? Because fundamental ideas might mean different things.
Profoundly different things sometimes. Take human rights. It's a concept everyone endorses, at least on paper.
But the interpretation varies wildly.
Massively. The Western European focus on individual rights is quite different from many non-Western traditions that historically put more emphasis on the group, the community, or duties. So you can have agreement on the surface term, human rights, but deep, culturally rooted disagreements simmering underneath.
Which can lead to that cultural posturing you mentioned.
Precisely. Where nations sort of perform their cultural identity to assert themselves or resist what they see as others imposing their views, it can really hinder actual negotiation.
And historically, the system itself wasn't neutral.
No. International law, international organizations, they were largely shaped by Western European cultural norms and assumptions. This historical imbalance can lead to dominant cultures trying to push their perspectives while other cultures push back, maybe in forms where they have a majority, like the UN General Assembly sometimes.
So this dynamic fuels division.
It can, yeah. It can encourage nations to emphasize their cultural uniqueness, sometimes leading to internal conflicts spilling over or these big good versus evil narratives globally. The source mentions the perceived clash between Islamic fundamentalism and aspects of a U.S. worldview as a dangerous example, risking confrontation.
It sounds almost like a new Cold War, but fought on multiple cultural fronts. That feels risky.
It is risky. It highlights why diplomats and politicians desperately need more cultural awareness, more sensitivity, to avoid getting stuck in these kinds of standoffs, paralyzed by cultural difference.
Is there any way forward? Does technology help?
Interestingly, yes. The sources suggest ICT's information and communication technologies could be a valuable tool.
How? By letting diplomats chat online.
Sort of, yeah. By facilitating more informal, continuous interactions between formal meetings, it could help reduce the need for that public cultural posturing and allow diplomats to get a better feel for their counterparts' actual cultural attitudes and assumptions beforehand.
So building understanding behind the scenes.
Exactly, moving towards compromise and consensus rather than just sticking rigidly to one's own culturally biased position.
Wow. We've really covered a lot of ground here, from digging into what culture even means to the promises and pitfalls of soft power and the complexities of cultural exchange and diplomacy. It's definitely not simple stuff.
Not at all. We've seen how these cultural dynamics shape everything from our personal sense of self and other right up to foreign policy decisions and how nations interact on the global stage. It really underscores how important critical thinking is, questioning assumptions in this hyperconnected world.
So here's something to chew on. If culture itself can be used to divide and rank people, and soft power isn't always as benign as it sounds, what does it genuinely mean to build global understanding? Especially when every perspective is, as one source put it, a positioned truth.
How do we celebrate diversity without just reinforcing old power structures? And maybe more personally, what role can each of us play in challenging those assumptions in our everyday lives, in our own interactions?
Lots to think about there. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We really hope this exploration has given you some new perspectives, maybe some new tools for navigating our complex world, particularly if international relations is your thing. And please don't forget to follow Diplomacy and International Relations by Bastian Freiburg wherever you get your podcasts. If you enjoyed today's discussion, maybe consider leaving a 5-star rating. It genuinely helps other curious minds find the show. Until next time, keep digging deeper.